Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Logical Shaman Podcast. My name is Zach, and I've got a big topic today. The question is, what is government? I'm sure a lot of you have some thoughts that are popping into your head right now. I actually asked some people what they thought government was on Facebook, and these are some of the responses I got. A failing, outdated system used to control the masses, Sean. Scott says, government is a man made system that tries to take the place of God. Leisha says, it's a fantasy that it is a small, transparent group of citizens chosen fairly by the people and for the people who represent the country's best interest in terms of macroeconomics and diplomatically in global affairs. She says the reality is it's a fucking mess. How do I even start to summarize the blatant overreach and severe imbalance of power this group of corporate puppet elites hold in this country? That was a mouthful. But I feel the emotion. I totally get where she's coming from. And to a large degree, I have to agree. But how do we know what we're talking about is true? How do we know what the government is? When you first, so I'm going to go over how to break down concepts and consider ideas from the ground up. Firstly, you have to identify something and you have to break down what are its universal characteristics that connect all those things that we give that label. For instance, what makes a dog and not a cat? What makes a book a book? Is it just a bound pieces of paper with words or images? Is this book that's a story the same as a book that's informational or a comic book? They're all still books. They all have the same characteristics of being bound paper with words or images that are conveying meaning or story to the reader. Now, this is a folder, but it has a cover and it binds loose paper, but they're loose. They're not connected, and this isn't sold or collected as this. It's just random paper collected with a folder. So this is not a book. So the essential characteristics that make something a book are specific to that thing, and when you break those essential characteristics, it's no longer a book. So then what are the essential characteristics of what makes a government and not a corporation or a religion or just a group of people doing something? What makes it a government? Well, we're going to go over the who, what, how, primarily, of government, and then I'll briefly touch on the when, where, and why. And I think you'll understand as we go through. Firstly, we'll start with the who and what, really, primarily focusing on the what. Close your eyes, unless you're driving. Close your eyes and picture government. What do you see? Do you see the buildings that looks like ancient Greece? See pillars? See people in suits? People with robes that are judges? People wearing badge and police uniforms? I even see words written on paper that are laws or the Constitution, documents that go along with government. Are these things the government? No, I mean, all of these characteristics could be applied to other things, buildings that look like ancient architecture. It could be a bank. It could be a private business. People dressing up in suits is like business or corporations, and people wear badges and uniforms that aren't police. And words are written down on paper and contract law or agreements between individuals that can be enforced with or without government. So these things are not what makes government government. They're just parts of government, like the words that are in the paper here, but this is not a book. So it has some of the similarities, but not the defining qualities that make it a book. So maybe it's what government does that makes a government a government. What are its functions and how does it act in the world? Construct, which is a collection of services which are combined in their efforts by a common region, organization, or peoples. I see what he's saying. So a government is defined by its collection of services. I can already imagine the services that he's talking about. Run schools, governments feed the poor, welfare, governments protect people and enforce laws, and governments build roads and infrastructure. These are definitely parts of government. But when you break it down, firstly, not all governments have the same services. So what collection of services makes something a government? Secondly, all of these services can be done without government. It doesn't require governments to have schools to feed the poor. You don't need a government to protect yourself or to enforce laws. We certainly have a credit score that has nothing to do with the government, and any contract you make, even if there wasn't a government to enforce it, you would be blackballed from doing business if you didn't adhere to your contracts. Roads are actually built by private companies. They're just paid by the government. And it's certainly within businesses' self-interest to make sure they have roads for people to get to them to buy their services. So, no, I wouldn't say that just a collection of services makes something a government. There's no universality there in that definition. And it's not required to have a government to do these services. You could have another organization like a church or a private business or just a group of friends, and you could do these services on your own. So no, I wouldn't say what it does or what its function is makes something definitionally a government. So this is where I think we get to the crux of the argument and the most important facet. This is what makes a government a government. How does a government do what it does? How does it get its funding, and how does it do the tasks that are either asked of it by the people or demanded of it by the government? How does it do it? Well, through taxation, primarily, either by taking your money directly from you with or without your consent, or by controlling the money supply by taxing you indirectly through inflation, also without your consent. So, what does it mean to do something without your consent? Well, consent is very important because once you take away consent, it turns perfectly fine situations into ones of violence and force. Sex is perfectly fine. Sex without consent is rape, and that's violence and force. Giving someone your money, perfectly fine. Someone taking that money without your consent is theft and robbery and is done with force and violence. So this essentially is how government pays for itself and how it functions. And this is what makes a government a government. Force, violence, and coercion used to pay for itself and its actions. This is the one through line that connects every government through history to the present day, that they all share in common 100%. Now I'm going to share with you a quote from my favorite philosopher on the topic, Lysander Spooner. He goes into how actual robbers and thieves are actually preferable to a government, and I think he puts it very succinctly. Let me drink some of my coffee first. So Lysander Spooner on robbers and thieves. The fact is that the government, like a highwayman, says to a man, your money or your life. And many, if not most, taxes are paid under the compulsion of that threat. The government does not indeed waylay a man in a lonely place, spring upon him from the roadside, and holding a pistol to his head, proceed to rifle through his pockets. But the robbery is nonetheless a robbery on that account, and it is far more dastardly and shameful, because the highwayman takes solely upon himself the responsibility, danger, and the crime of his own act. He does not pretend that he has any rightful claim to your money, or that he intends to use it for your benefit. He does not pretend to be anything but a robber. He does not claim, unlike government, to be merely your protector, and that he takes men's money against their will merely to enable him to protect those infatuated travelers who feel perfectly able to protect themselves or do not appreciate his peculiar system of protection. He is too sensible a man to make such a profession as professions as these. Furthermore, having taken your money, he leaves you as you wish him to do. He does not persist in following you around on the road against your will, assuming to be your rightful sovereign on account of the protection he affords you. He does not keep protecting you by commanding you to bow down and serve him, by requiring you to do this and forbid you to do that, by robbing you of more money as often as he finds it for his interest or pleasure to do so, and by branding you as a rebel, a traitor, and an enemy to your country, and shooting you down without mercy if you dispute his authority or resist his demands. He is too much of a gentleman to be guilty of such impostures and insults and villainies as these. In short, he does not, in addition to robbing you, attempt to make you either his dupe or his slave. He goes on to say, if taxation without consent is not robbery, then any band of robbers have only to declare themselves a government, and all their robberies are legalized. So, what is government? Government seems to be a group of people with the social permission to initiate violence against other people, to pay for their organization and enforce their rules upon those people with or without their consent. Or as Philip on Facebook said, it's a group of people with a monopoly on force. So I think I've made the case clear that this is the defining characteristic of what a government is. It is force and violence and coercion used to pay for itself and fund its actions. So I will go on now to briefly touch on when, where, and why, but I think the primary point has already been made. When is government? It goes back into ancient times, and as a previous commenter said, Scott, he mentioned or likened government to a religion. I think that's 100% accurate. Government started as religion, where people literally thought God was their ruler. The Pharaoh was God on earth. Until eventually, over time, that didn't make that much sense anymore. People realized that probably wasn't God, but maybe the ruler was appointed by God, by a king rightfully anointed by God. And over time, that started to make less sense. Were these kings really appointed by God? No, maybe there's other mechanisms. So eventually, it became more secular. There were republics, and now there are democracies, and these are just other forms following the same patterns with different trappings, but they're essentially the same. The one thing that hasn't changed is the force, violence, and coercion. Only the appearance has changed. Where is government? You could say government is in every country, or wherever there are people, there is most likely a government. But where is the government housed? Is it in the buildings? Is it in the laws? Is it in the rituals? I think it's more accurate to say that government exists solely in the mind of people. As soon as people stop believing in government, that work in government and that give government their money and obey government, then there will be government. But as soon as people change their mind and step away, the trappings of government do not sustain it. It's the belief system and the opinions of the mind that create government. Why is government? So this is an important question. Why do we have government if it's a bad thing for us? Rosemary from Facebook had this to say: ideal government is limited in power and scope, and one of its responsibilities is to protect the fundamental freedoms of the citizenry. Governments nowadays are behemoths. They grow like malignant cancers and impinge on the daily lives and freedoms of citizens from birth to death. I definitely agree with that last sentence, but I think her first sentence shows us where the fatal flaw is in most people's thinking. She said, again, I'll read it. One of its responsibilities of government is to protect the fundamental freedoms of the citizenry. But according to the definition we just established, in order to protect your fundamental freedoms, government must use force, violence, and coercion. So it's a contradiction in terms to think that you can protect someone's fundamental freedoms by stepping on those freedoms with force, violence, and coercion. It's a contradictory, self-detonating thought. There's no way a government can protect your freedoms by taking away your freedoms. I'll end on this quote, also from Lysander Spooner, and I'm sure this topic will come up more in the future, and there's a lot to explore. And please leave your opinions in the comments below, and message me if you would like to have further dialogue on the channel. But here's Lysander Spooner. A man's natural rights are his own against the whole world, and any infringement of them is equally a crime, whether committed by one man or by millions, whether committed by one man calling himself a robber or by millions calling themselves a government.